I had a very rare form of cancer and the doctors decided to operate on me. On the operating table, they gave me an anesthetic, which was very effective. After a while, I felt like I was above the operating room, right under the headlights. I was 2 meters high, surrounded by what looked like a cathedral, with a ceiling that was at least 6 meters high. I watched the bustling scene in the operating room. Doctors and internship students came to watch, as this surgery is extremely rare. Where I come from, 1 or 2 people get it every year, and many die without getting a diagnosis. As it turned out, I was lucky. As I floated in the air anticipating the start of the surgery, I had a completely different view of the world. I felt a great sense of relief, a great sense of inner peace. I looked at my sleeping body and knew that it was me, but it wasn't really me. As if my body was a machine, temporarily borrowed, I could feel the emotions of the doctors as I observed the operating room, and soon a surgical team of 3 doctors gathered. The attending surgeon was an older professor, then 60 years old, who had performed such surgeries in his youth. The other doctors had no experience in the treatment of the disease. In the moments before the surgery began, all participants and observers became very nervous, with a mixture of excitement and fear. For a few seconds, everyone was silent and did not do anything. After that, the main surgeon made an incision on the skin. I watched as the tissue was gradually cut open, getting deeper and deeper. The tension was incredible, and for a while the professor was watching the tumor, but not touching it. They thought it was the tumor, and finally the professor decided to make the cut, and I felt that many people in the operating room were very nervous. At the moment the scalpel touched the tumor, it was as if time suddenly slowed down. Many things were happening at the same time. I felt panic, and at the same moment, a high-pitched scream came from the device that measured the heart rate. Everyone in the operating room became anxious. Time was stretched out and it looked like a painting of people with their hands intertwined, passing things to each other, trying to do something. At this moment, I felt a strong suction, so strong that I couldn't resist, despite my efforts to do so. The chaos and panic and screams below were indescribable, but that too lasted less than a second. Next moment, I passed through a dark tunnel with some bright lights and a yellow dot shining at the front of the tunnel. The tunnel threw me out. There was no floor here, the air shone yellow, similar to a very dense fog, but one could see through it. Instantly, 5 glowing figures appeared in front of me. One of them was supposed to be in charge. I think it was a woman, and I didn't recognize any of them. I tried to see her facial features, but the more I stared, the less I could see. When I gave up, I felt her facial features. The group was very enthusiastic and we were communicating with our thoughts. They took me to a strange place where 3 spheres formed an equilateral triangle, and in the middle there was another sphere, but larger than the other 3. I asked what it was and I didn't get an answer, but I felt it change. I felt like I was moving. I saw the stars. It was so wide. I understood that if I turned around, I would see the earth. I turned around and I was amazed by what I saw. The earth was so wonderful and so close. I felt that she was alive, as if the earth itself was a life. As I admired it for a while, I looked around and noticed that there were many objects revolving around the earth. I felt that there was a great deal of life on the earth, like a hive of awakened bees. I simultaneously felt vitality, happiness, and enthusiasm as they poured out of the earth. At this moment, I found myself back in the yellow fog and the sense of time was blurred. I watched as 2 boys welcomed me. These 2 boys took me to another strange place, a very beautiful place where everything was real, and I found myself at the edge of a lake. It was autumn. We were sitting by the lake and the leaves of the trees turned yellow and then fell off. Then it rained. And when it stopped raining, it started snowing. The lake froze over. It snowed for a long time. Then the snowfall stopped and everything was frozen. It was an extremely long winter. Finally, the ice began to melt. Spring came, full of flowers, then a sultry summer with many insects, and finally it became autumn. Until now, I didn't understand the meaning of this yearly cycle of seasons. The children led me forward, and on the way I ran into a very tall man, a real giant, about 40 years old, leading a horse. He had gone to a neighboring city to sell something. He was walking dejectedly, and suddenly it was as if I were this man, and I was looking at the world through his eyes. He had 8 children, the last of whom had just been born. He was a poor farmer, unable to support his family, but among all farmers he was considered middle class. He lived outside the city and farmed the land. I understood all of this when I began to look through his eyes. The picture I saw through his eyes was so startling that the streets were 2 meters narrow. The road was covered with very thick mud. An old woman, who looked like a witch, was selling me something disgusting. At one of the intersections, there were unclothed children standing there, looking at me with wide eyes, who seemed to have mental defects. I walked through the crowd until I reached the center of the city. All the citizens were gathered in the square. They stayed behind a cordon of soldiers, who wore armor and carried swords. 4 gallows were erected in the middle of the square. In them were people who were about to be hanged. At that moment, I saw his own son lying on the gallows. He roared and rushed to the gallows. One of the knights stopped him and stabbed him straight through the heart. He fell to the ground, dead, and I began to watch it all as the invisible man. When the crowd saw this, they ripped open the cordon and a terrible massacre took place. I was crying and shaking, and although I had no physical body, this is what I felt. The children soothed me for a long time until I came to my senses. When I regained consciousness, I was back in the yellow fog myself. Suddenly it became dark, as if someone had turned off the lights in the fog. I became very frightened and I started to shout, "What is happening? What happened?" I felt at that moment that something bad would happen to me and that my fate would be decided. No one answered me, and then I heard a voice coming from far away, a voice very far away. "Everything will be fine, everything will be fine." I listened to the voice and I calmed down a little. After a while, the sky became light again and I became relaxed. Later, when I told my parents about it, my mother cried and said that she was saying the same thing to me in her heart throughout the surgery. Then the kids pulled me aside and had a long talk, at the end of which we said goodbye to each other, and then I went back to the operating table. I could feel the doctors working on me, but I couldn't say anything or even move, and I was in pain. I don't know how long it took, but I felt someone holding my hand, and I opened my eyes and saw my parents, who were happy that I hadn't left them.